All right. I'll just give a couple of minutes for the rest of my panelists to join. Welcome, everyone. I see we're almost all here. Awesome. Great. So this is a real pleasure to host this panel with people whose work I have admired and been watching for years. I'm going to give some real brief introductions, and then in the interest of picking up a little time, I'll let them just jump right into some opening remarks. But then we want to leave as much time as possible for questions from the audience. So please go ahead and be thinking about questions you want to ask our panelists. So first off, we have Michael Conger. Michael has done qualitative research on B corporations, which he's going to talk about. He's based in Ohio, and you may know him for his paper, Conger, McMullen, Bergman, and York, 2018, in the JBV special issue on B Corps. Second is going to be Nancy Kurland. Nancy is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in Lancaster, a little bit of trivia. So I know that area well, and she's going to talk about her work on ESOPs and benefit corporations. She's done a number of pieces, including a California Management Review article in 2018. After that, we'll hear from Suntae Kim. Suntae is in Boston at Boston College, and he has at least one working paper that I know of that's been making the rounds, and I'm excited to hear about some of the challenges he's been facing doing quantitative work on B Corps. And then last but not least, we have Kendall Park, who is based in Nashville, Tennessee. And Kendall gets a huge shout out. We were originally hoping to have Oana Branzei with us today, but she had an emergency, and Kendall graciously agreed to step in at the last minute. So with that, I'm going to turn over the panel to Michael to maybe get us kicked off. I asked the panelists to just say a few words about, sort of when, why, and how they got started studying B corporations. A little bit about the work they've done to date, including maybe the research designs, and then just a little preview of some of the challenges they've faced in, getting access to their research settings or the data that they've needed, and then we'll open it up to questions. So is that good, everyone?
Yep.
Perfect. I'll turn it over to you, Michael. Please go ahead.
Wonderful. Can you hear me? Is that all right? You good? Okay. So thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be on a panel with all these great scholars. I'm lucky to be here, and I became aware of B Corps early in grad school. I went to Colorado. Go Buffs! I see a couple other Colorado people on here. So, but at that time, Boulder, Denver, it was B Corps were pretty brand new. That was around 2010. B Corps were pretty brand new, but a unusually high concentration in Boulder and Denver, right? So I had an embarrassment of riches in terms of access at that time. And if you know anything about Boulder, you can't go to a brew pub without running into an entrepreneur. So that's I just sort of fell into that through normal contacts with people. But then also lots of discussion at that time, the cohort of us who were going through grad school at that time. So Sophie Bach, Dave Gross, Matt Lee, basically everybody orbiting around Tom Lumpkin at that time. B Corps were something we talked about a lot. So that's how I understood about B Corps, became interested in them, and worked with Jeff York, Jeff McMullen, several other folks there doing my dissertation. So my dissertation was all papers on B Corps. Some of that was now working papers that have languished for many, many years. Some quantitative stuff. So I'll leave the bemoaning. I'm sure any problems I may have had with quantitative data, Suntae has experienced far more. So he can probably speak to those a lot better about what that kind of data is like. But most of my other work, that stuff has been a state-by-state introduction of benefit corporation study, which I think Joel has seen before. That one was really difficult. Also kind of factors that allow hybrid firms to deal with tension in ways other than decoupling, a la Passion Santos. That's also due to data difficulties, plus laziness on my part has languished. But the ones that are really kind of active now are the paper that Joel talked about, and shout out to Joel, who has given me lots of good advice on that. He was involved in that special issue as well. And to Oana, who was our editor on that paper, really helped shape that and make it into a viable paper that I think is now worth reading. So that paper, if you haven't seen it, is about basically what happens to the way that companies evaluate their opportunities once they join a category like the B Corp category in this case. And what we found was that it varies a lot, right? So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but just that's a really interesting thing that I think that was all qualitative work and came out of sort of a deeper qualitative dive into doing that. And then most recently, I have a working paper right now. It's brand new, kind of inspired very much by Tom Lumpkin and Sophie's civic wealth creation ideas, looking at how the role of collective action by B Corps and other kinds of social enterprise groups can help with local social entrepreneurship and ecosystem building, looking at a new food hub here in Cincinnati. So that's a whirlwind tour of kind of the work that I'm doing. As I said, I've tried a couple other things. I'll let other experts speak to other kind of methods, but primarily on the qualitative side, I think access. I've had this experience. I guess there was two comments I wanted to say. It really is dependent on how lucky you are, right? So in Colorado, I had tons of access and could easily get a hold of people, easily find people. There are now, I don't know, 70 some, or I would guess, B Corps out there. At the time I was doing it, at least 20 or 30. Here in Cincinnati, we maybe have a dozen, maybe, right? And most of them are not particularly active. So it's a big challenge in that way to kind of track people down. I think what I've found for that stuff is it's been really a matter of doing kind of old-fashioned, cold calling people, digging through websites, all of that stuff, just hard to access people. But of course, I'm sure you all know, once you find somebody who's in a B Corp, they love to talk about it and they love to stay connected with you, and they're very generous. So other than that connection piece, I don't know that there's a lot of big barriers that are different than regular qualitative research. The other thing I think that's a factor in general that I will say is just the relative newness and small size of the B Corp community. I've struggled getting through with reviewers, disentangling that, right? There's a lot of questions about endogeneity, equifinality, all that kind of stuff when you have such a small sample. And also the diversity, which I think is this will be my last comment. I think the diversity, which is I think both a difficulty in studying, because it's making those comparisons across firms is really difficult, but also a strength, right? This is something that the B Corp context can help us do some research where we're not looking at 200 firms all in the disk drive industry or, whatever. That diversity helps you kind of unpack these things like collective identity and collective action, things like that, and how those firms work together. So those are some quick observations. I'll be quiet now.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michael. So next we're going to hear from Nancy. And so Michael has used a qualitative method, at least the paper I'm most familiar with, and has studied quite a number of firms. Nancy, I mean, one of the things that really is interesting about your work is you've gone really deep into a single firm, at least the papers I'm most familiar that you've done. So, maybe tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Sure. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm a little bit more of a latecomer compared to Michael in terms of the field. I got introduced to it in 2015. I was revising a senior seminar at Franklin and Marshall on corporate responsibility, and I was talking with a colleague of mine who's a lawyer. He started telling me about benefit corporations, and that got me interested in the topic. And so I went to the Academy of Management in Vancouver And I went to a session on benefit corps, and I met Ian McFarlane, who I think is in the audience somewhere. And he's the CEO, president and CEO of a company called EA Engineering, Science and Technology. And so I took his card, and a few months later, I called him up because I realized I was ready to start doing research. And then the rest is history. He been very generous with his time, with his company's time. My papers are largely focused on his company and his company's journey to becoming a benefit corp. I was particularly intrigued by EA because they are an employee-owned benefit corp. So they started out in the 1970s as a sole proprietorship, and then they went public in the 80s, and that was not something that accorded well with their culture, so they reprivatized. They became a partial ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, and then in 2015, they decided to become 100% employee-owned public benefit corp, registered in Delaware. And so around the time that I was studying EA, I was trying to also understand if there were other employee-owned benefit corps. And at the time, I only found 7 out of all of benefit corps. I had one of my students do this systematic research of getting files from all the different states and all the companies that were categorized as benefit corps. And she went through the websites, et cetera, and we only found 7. But then in later research, I think Marjorie Kelly in her 50 by 50 work has found some more. In terms of my research, as Joel said, it's qualitative. I go deep dive. For my B Corp, again, I've primarily relied on my relationship with Ian. So I've established a relationship with the company, and I've written now 2 papers that have come out that Joel mentioned. The first one is a Business Horizons paper. I was very interested in the accountability. How do we hold benefit corps accountable to their expanded stakeholder mandate? And what I found is when I was talking with EA is that there's no template for how you determine what a benefit corp should do once it becomes a benefit corp. They're not required to follow the B Corp assessment, so they don't have that guidance. They're only required to do a biennial report to their shareholders, so the other stakeholders are not part of that. And so how do they do that? And so as I was doing my research, I was very influenced by Brianna Cummings' Columbia Law Review article, and she talked about the importance of internal culture. And so a company should look at accountability mechanisms within inside the company and not rely so much on external control mechanisms. And so in looking at EA's company, EA, I saw that what they did is they developed a very strong internal structure to implement the benefit corp. Then the California Management Review paper that Joel mentioned relates to the intersection. What are the synergies between being an ESOP and a benefit corp? And what I saw is that the benefit corp helps to establish the ownership culture required for an ESOP, and the ESOP helps to establish or provide moral accountability for the benefit corp. And then I'm also working on 2 other papers, and I'll leave that for another time, but they're related to the hybridization and what is the process by which a company goes through in terms of becoming a hybrid organization. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. Next, we're going to hear from Suntae, and I'm looking forward to getting an update. I know there's at least, as I mentioned, 1 working paper that Suntae and Todd have been working on, which uses a quantitative approach. So we're going to kind of pivot from a qual to quant now. And maybe you can tell us about that project and whatever else is going on for you, Suntae.
Sure. Can you hear me? All right. So my research that I'm doing with Todd Scheifling at Temple University is a little bit different from other research in the sense that it's more macro perspective. It's looking at the B Corp movement emergence in the context of traditional corporations. And also, it's more of the mixed method research. So it started as quantitative, it went to qualitative, and then it's coming back to quantitative in a sense. So it's an ongoing process. It's going through the review process in a journal. So I started this research out of my interest in alternative organizational forms to profit maximizing corporations. The project itself began during my doctoral studies, and so it's been a long time, but it continuously makes me excited. So in this research, our initial question was how the behaviors of traditional corporations create a fertile ground for B Corps to grow, especially during the early days when the movement had to grow from.
I think you're frozen.
Suntae, you just glitched a little bit. We'll see if it comes back. Give him a second. Well, Kendall, I may have to put you doubly in the hot seat. Let's see what happens with Suntae. Okay. Suntae, we just lost you for a little bit, so you may have to repeat some
I'm
of what
sorry.
you said. No, that's okay. No problem. It's a reality of making live television.
Yeah, there are multiple Zoom sessions going on in our household. I'm sorry about that. So we thought, initially we thought more B Corps would emerge in the industries where large corporations were doing more of the profit maximization because B Corps rose against that trend. Then we also came up with a different prediction that maybe B Corps were emerging against many traditional corporations attempting to look good and green, especially through their surface level actions, so-called greenwashing. So we collected variables reflecting these two different types of corporate behaviors and ran regression. The result was surprising. Although we did not explicitly think that the two predictions were competing, we found that both sets of variables strongly predicted the number of B Corps in the industry. So this got us thinking, oh, maybe there's something here. Let's dig deeper. So that's when we went qualitative. So we looked to the qualitative data on the reasons why B Corp adopted their certification. They're no longer available in the current B Lab website, but in the old days, B Lab website provided such qualitative information. We scraped all of them and content analyzed them, and the outcome showed a notable pattern. There were two groups of B Corps. One group said they became certified to transform the status quo and revolutionize the capitalism that we currently know. We labeled them oppositional B Corps. And the other group said they joined the movement because they had been a social enterprise even before the term was invented. And the B Corp certification essentially gives them a stamp of authenticity. So we labeled them authenticity B Corps. We found that most B Corps cited either one of these two reasons. We further investigated this pattern through computational text analysis. We identified most frequent and distinctive words that each group used and created a network of vocabularies based on co-occurrences. Seeing this, we were like, oh, this is interesting, and let's see if this distinction does anything. We analyzed these certification patterns. We found that the opposition group, oppositional B Corps, tended to stay longer in the movement than the authenticity group. We also analyzed their influence over new corp emergence. We found that more new B Corps emerged in the industries where there were many existing oppositional B Corps, but the number of existing authenticity B Corps did not have a significant impact. So currently we are in the process of further developing these findings. Specifically, we are focusing on how these two groups reacted differently to some of the issues that arose during the history of the B Corp movement, especially at the interface between B Corps and traditional corporations, such as Ben & Jerry's certification that changed the rule around the certification, and Danone's potential certification, and Etsy's decertification through its IPO. So this is the research that I'm doing right now. And in order to further develop the research, I would like to know a little bit more about the history of the B Corp movement. It's now more than a decade old, although it has accumulated a significant history. I have the impression that the movement is still very much forward-looking, and that there hasn't been a lot of reflection on its past. So it'll be really great if researchers could get more access to the traces of the winding roads in the wake of the movement's development, so that all the researchers could also join the process of reflection. So that's it for me.
That's great. Thank you, Suntae, for that update. And I've got to connect with you offline and see the latest on that paper. That sounds amazing. one of the things just I'll mention before I pass it over to Kendall is in some of my research, I've been using archive.org. So if you've not used that, that is a way to go back to prior versions of websites. And in particular, you can basically see past instances of the B-Lab directory, among other things. And so that's a great resource for a kind of memory and trace. Next, I want to turn it over to Kendall. I've known Kendall for several years now, and notably, she did her PhD at Princeton and did her dissertation on B Corps. And so I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit about the experiences of doing a dissertation on B Corps, and then how you go about trying to turn a dissertation into publications. So over to you.
If anybody has thoughts on that, I would welcome it. I'll keep it really short and sweet. I am in the earliest stage of my career out of anyone here. So I'm really honored to be here, even if it's sort of a happy accident. I've been following the work of these other scholars for a while. So as Joel said, well, I'm a postdoc at Vanderbilt right now. I guess I'm actually an incoming assistant professor at Vanderbilt at Owen Business School, although I've deferred a year. So I'm a postdoc for another year. And I did my dissertation work on B Corps. I was a sociologist and had been studying primarily consumers, so conscious consumption, ethical consumption, whatever you want to call it. And after doing a little bit of work, publishing in some consumer behavior outlets, I became interested in actually the production of this kind of meaning in capitalist structures. So thinking about how corporations actually convinced these consumers and these social movements that they were ethical, right, or that they were responsible. And that led me to B Corps and benefit corporations. So this to me just seems like a really rich empirical context. I saw them kind of cropping up everywhere. It seems like a really interesting sort of signaling mechanism. So I studied B Corps and benefit corporations as part of my dissertation work. I just saw them as really qualitatively different than other kinds of social movements and other kinds of NGOs that were pushing for change in this sector, although they adopted many of the same kinds of values. And I started before B-Lab was publishing their data on Data World, or at least before I realized they were publishing their data on Data World. So I created a census of all of the B Corps worldwide from the B-Lab website. I created a census of all of the benefit corporations in the country and took random samples and started conducting interviews with the leaders and the founders of those companies. So my dissertation work is made up of 60 some odd interviews, or interviews with 60 some odd, leaders of 60 or so companies, B Corps, and then about a dozen or so benefit corporations and about another dozen or so companies that were considering certification. And I actually, as you said, Michael, I found it pretty easy to connect with these leaders. I think that the leaders of B Corps are kind of unique in that they're really receptive to talking to academics. They're pretty excited about the kind of work they're doing. So I ended up with a 67% response rate, just because this group seems really receptive to talking to academics. So that wasn't a barrier as much. I used modified grounded theory. I have a couple of working papers, one that's under review. But the barriers for me really might be just sort of a product of my background coming from sociology and trying to publish in management, is that I've had a hard time publishing, my qualitative work. I think that maybe qualitative research methods are a little bit better understood in sociology or better accepted, at least in some journals. There are slightly different conventions, and my dissertation was a book. So trying to translate this into articles has been a little bit of work. I similarly have gotten some pushback from reviewers who have, argued that this context might be a bit idiosyncratic, have worried about generalizability. But, the paper that I have right now that's under review is really looking at, the impact assessment as a voluntary sustainability standard, thinking about how these kinds of standards, this kind of assessment might shape companies' priorities and practices. So I'm going to leave it at that just so that I don't take up any more time.
That is fantastic. Thank you very much, Kendall. So I think we've done a great job here of setting the stage. We've got about 20 minutes to go in our session, not quite. I have some questions ready, but I'm going to just see if I can give me a second and scan through the stage. The first question came in from Raphael about how do we access the BIA and the SDG. In addition to Dan, Michelle Bradley is here in the audience today, and she posted an answer. The short answer is that access to the BIA data, there was a beta version of that was tested in 2019. I was part of that testing group, and the goal is to make that publicly available via the WORDS platform. So that's the Wharton Research Data Services. So many of your universities are already subscribing to that data, and hopefully in the next couple of months, that's going to be released. The other part that's coming up in the chat is, and I think Kendall mentioned it as well, there's a data set at Data World. And so that is, whereas the BIA is basically all of the test takers, regardless of whether they certify or not, the Data World data is of the certified companies and their various certification cycles. So you may want to look at that. There are a few other data sets out there, like the Best for the World and so forth. Okay, I'm going to just keep scrolling down now. There was a question, how does someone go about trying to find published journal articles that have published that have utilized the B Corp impact data set? I don't know, short of using Google Scholar and maybe looking for Data World and B Corp, how to find that specifically. With one of my doctoral students, Cacao, who's also in the audience, we have cataloged all the papers that are about benefit corporations and B Corps. A little over 200 papers as of the end of 2018, and we published a summary of that in AMD. But specific to the Data World data set, I don't know. Anything from the panelists on that one? No one wants to jump in on that. Okay. Suntae, I think people were excited about your the work you had done. There's a question from Armand. How can we access the reasons for becoming a B Corp that Suntae was talking about that are not available in any other way? Obviously, your paper is in progress, and that will eventually be published. But short of that, is there any other artifact at the moment?
As far as I know, at some point, this may be better answered by B Lab folks, but at some point they stopped publishing these qualitative reasons why B Corp became a B Corp. Maybe it's a reflection that B Corp movement has established. Maybe they don't have to ask that question anymore. But in the beginning, at least as I know, until like 2012, 13, that question was posed, and the new B Corps answered that question, and those answers were posted on the B Lab webpage. Those pages are no longer available, so maybe you can use the archive.org. There's another website, Wayback Machine. So you can also use Wayback Machine to get access to old web pages that are not available anymore. So they, yeah, I'm also curious if B Lab is asking that question, still asking that question, but not publishing.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, maybe I can just add a little bit of context. So as I understand it, Suntae, on the directory page that you used to be able to see for each company, one of the questions was, why did you become a B corporation? And then there was like a paragraph. And I think what you're pointing out is that either B Lab may not ask that question of the certifying companies anymore, and or it's not providing that answer on the directory. And so it's a much thinner presentation of the companies on each directory page in terms of their motivations. And as researchers, that means there's less available for us to work from for this kind of project where you're trying to do a kind of combination mixed methods, where you take some insights from your qualitative work and try to then look at that quantitatively. So that's good. Let me just keep going through the list here. There was a question about how did you create a list of benefit corporations? Did you create it state by state? I think that's maybe for you, Kendall, and maybe Nancy. I mean, you haven't really looked at more than just one, but I'll come to you after Kendall.
Yeah, so I went state by state. I looked at the state filing websites for every state that at the time had benefit corporation legislation. Most of them had it available. I then kind of cross-referenced that. At the time, B Lab was also doing a find a benefit corporation function on their website. I'm not sure if they still are, but I was going through and looking at those. I will say, I was thinking before this panel about some more data that I would like to see, some more info that I would like from B Lab. And this is an area where I think there's some room for improvement because the data quality is not great. Those state filing websites and B Lab's kind of own list of benefit corporations when I went through and looked at that census, about half of those companies didn't exist, and ostensibly really never existed. They had just incorporated and then fallen off the map. When I reached out to do interviews with those, the leaders and founders of those companies, some of them didn't even realize that they were benefit corporations. They had just kind of checked a box on their filing documents. So that's how I did it. I went through and gathered those lists state by state. There might be a better and easier way to do it now. This was a couple of years ago. But at the time, that's how I did it. It's just, you're going to get a lot of data and it's not all going to be super useful if that's the method that you use.
That's how I did it in 2011 also. And I think the first step in publishing from your dissertation is to name it, be the change : something. So, and if you out here me, but that's the way to go. But yeah, I think that's the other thing that comes up is which I think what you said is you have to have somebody vetting that data. It'd be helpful to have a coordinated effort through B-Lab or something, because the other thing that happens if you look at, I looked at the passage of benefit corporation laws, and not just their passage, but the whole process through the legislative process. And what you find when you go to talk to some of those people, I talked to a legislator in Montana who said, well, I was like, how did this pass with you guys, right? And I thought there would be a very sciencey answer or policy answer. And he said, well, we only actually meet as a legislature once every 2 years. And I believe that came up right before lunch. And so we just all voted yes because we wanted to go to lunch. And that's something that, we don't capture. That's not something you see by looking at data sets. So I think there has to be a more coordinated effort, like the kind of digging that Kendall has done to find those things out. Otherwise, it's just totally unreliable data, right?
Nancy, and just if I can hold you there a second, I want to see if Nancy wanted to chime in at all before we could.
Oh, yeah, I just want to say that I went through the same process Kendall did probably a few years before you. It sounds like we all did the same thing, so maybe we could stop duplicating each other's efforts.
We should have been talking before.
Right. I was looking for benefit corps who obviously had been previously incorporated as something else, that they weren't they weren't becoming benefit corps when they were created, but something like EA, where it was established in 1974, or Laureate International, where these are companies that have been around for a long time and then became a benefit corp later. And then I was also looking for companies that were also employee owned, and so that intersection was very small. But yes,
it's good. So,
by the way, Kendall, I read your dissertation.
It was great. A softball plug for one of the things that I think B Academics hopes to accomplish, which is one of my ambitions for our organization is that we'll start making some of these most frequently desired data sets sort of crowdsourced and available. But that will require people like Nancy and Kendall and Michael sharing some of the work products that they've created, so that we can create something that is larger than the sort of individual contributions. But I think continue to watch what we're doing here at B Academics. That's one of my ambitions, is that we might have the best curated list of benefit corporations, or the most hygienic version of the certified B corporations. So even though the data is at Data World, you'll find that there are problems or missing observations. So why should we all clean that up multiple times? Okay, so we have about 10 minutes to go. I just want to kind of scan through the list here. There's a question here from Tamara. Are there any funding sources, grants, or RFPs you know of for B Corporate related research, especially in emerging countries? So Tamara, as you know, there was just recently a call that was jointly sponsored by B-Lab, Sistema Bay, B Academics, Academia Bay, and that has funding from IDRC, which is a Canadian development aid organization. And we gave out, I can't remember the exact number, order of magnitude $100,000 Canadian to 4 research teams. Michelle, who's in the audience, could also comment on that. She was integrally involved in that. I'm not aware of plans to replicate that particular call, but this is a place, again, where B Academics is going to actively be trying to create funders who want to fund this research. And so stay tuned, as to whether we can accomplish that or not, but that's our goal. is to create small grants that would seed research. And so that's part of what we're going to focus on. The three of you, how have you funded your research? Any grants? I mean, how does it work?
I got a small grant from Rutgers. They have an employee ownership, the Beister and Symposium, and they have a grant called the Kevin E. Rubel Scholarship in Corporate Conscious Capitalism. And so I had a small grant from them.
I got
good.
So, back at Dissertation Days, shout out again to University of Colorado. They have a corporate social responsibility arm as part of the business school, and that organization has been very generous to me, and I know other people doing social and environmental kind of work. So, but no, otherwise, no.
Yeah.
No funding on my end. Just landed at universities that had money to support my research.
Yeah, so like internal research funds, these sorts of things.
That's right.
I mean, I think, the good news is that some of this research doesn't take a ton of money. I mean, if you want to get into interviews and you want to maybe have your interviews professionally transcribed, that starts to create some costs. Although technology is kind of moving there. I don't know if any of you guys are using Zoom. If you record to the cloud, you get a real-time AI transcription, for free. So, there's stuff like that that's happening that kind of changes some of the dynamics of even transcription. There's a comment from Michelle Bradley about the Benefit Corps saying that they no longer compile that. There is a paper, I can't think of the citation offhand, that produced a data set. It was in a law review journal of all of the B Corps through about 2017. I'm using that data in a different project. So that's a pretty clean data set that had one nice feature for us, which is it lists the date of incorporation. So even if you go to benefitcorporation.net, you have no idea when that firm incorporated. So if you have any kind of temporally sensitive analysis you want to do, that's not that useful. Please help me if I missed any questions in the stream. I feel like I have caught them all. I'll come back with one of mine. So I want you guys to give away some of your best research ideas now, because I know you have more than you'll ever get to. So what do you think are some of the key questions that you think academics can help answer related to B Corps? Like what next, even if you can't get to it? Go ahead, Nancy.
I just wanted, this is the one that's really important and topical, and I know based on the presentations earlier that B Lab is thinking about it, but what are the implications of COVID-19 for B Corps? So that would be, how are they faring? Are they faring better because they take care of their employees? Or are they faring worse because they tend to be smaller and they have other costs? So I'm curious what the fallout will be for B Corps.
Excellent, good. Kendall?
I'm really interested in the idea of these kinds of standards being used as enforcement mechanisms and as credible commitments as a way for companies to signal their commitment to sustainability and social impact for the long run. There's a lot of rhetoric around that if you're in the B Corp world. There's a lot of talk about, right, like, securing your mission for the long run. And so I would be really interested to see how these devices are being used to do that, right? What are the enforcement mechanisms? We know that companies in states that have benefit corporation legislation are supposed to reincorporate as benefit corporations, but from what I can tell, that hasn't been happening. So, right, how are these kinds of voluntary certification bodies actually enforcing some of these requirements, and how are firms responding to that? I think is still an open question, and this is a really great context to be looking at some of that kind of credible commitment stuff.
That's great. Michael?
Yeah, so I'm going to steal both of those ideas. But those are great. I think, so this bigger question, I have two quick ones. One, the bigger question of like, how and why this is something I've been interested in a while. How and why do these organizations, these companies become involved in? How do they engage and experience in the collective action by joining the B Corp movement? But I think what's more interesting now is sort of like, what are the outcomes that are coming out of that? Like what happens? The paper that I did is just a starting point for, I think, lots of things we can see. What happens when firms join this movement. And so many, when an ice cream firm and a paper company and an insurance company and a law firm all join this together, that sounds like the beginning of a good joke, but they all walk into a bar, like what happens, right? And I think there's lots of, this is a great context for multi-level stuff, which is always so hard to get reviewers to swallow. But I think it makes a ton of sense here. And then the other piece is I'm an entrepreneurship guy primarily. That's my entrepreneurship division is my home, right? So how can this help us think about opportunity in a new way, right? So we talk a lot about opportunity recognition, discovery, creation, whatever. Like there's that whole battle, and I've even been part of that. But Jeff McMullen and Dimo Dimoff have talked a lot more about opportunity development, right? And something that always jumps out to me is you talk to people who get a B Corp certification, and they say the B Corp certification opened our eyes to all this stuff we could be doing. And there's all this kind of like organizational development stuff, opportunity development stuff. So entrepreneurship side, that's like opportunity development, but bigger picture for management scholars, I think, is that all organizations change because of being a part of this movement. I think that's super, super interesting, and it's a really cool context for that.
I have two more if I have time.
I'll give you 1 minute if you don't mind, Nancy. That's great.
Okay, great. So I was asked, I took this question because Joel gave it to us before the panel, and I asked some folks. And so locally, there's an organization called Assets of PA, and Jonathan Coleman, who's the co-CEO there, wrote back to me telling me that his question for research is how do we get better data about the financial performance of B Corps compared to normal companies? So really, we need to have that data. And then the other question following up on what Kendall said is that we need to understand more about how companies benefit corporations rather than B Corps per se are implementing this structure to be accountable to a larger stakeholder mandate, particularly if they're not getting guidance from a B, they're not adhering to the B impact assessment. So
very good. So I'm mindful of the time. My job, one of my jobs, in addition to having an amazing panel, was to get us back on track. And I think we have done it.
Wow.
So I'm going to have to leave it here. But I want to first say a few thank yous. Thank you, Nancy, very much for joining us. Thank you, Kendall, for stepping in at the last minute. Thank you, Michael. I think Suntae must have had a bandwidth problem, so I'll say in absentia. Thank you to Suntae. I have a request for the entire audience. If B Academics is in the process of going through our first 5-year strategic plan, we know that there's an opportunity to provide data that would be of use to a large community of researchers. We are a small organization. We'll have to make choices about what we can do. Please email me personally if you have suggestions for what you think are the most valuable data we could provide. And don't just ask what we can do for you. Tell me what you're prepared to contribute to helping bring that particular data set to life. So if you have data you're sitting on that you would be prepared to put into a community pool, let me know about that. And we'll be working through a prioritization process by which we can decide where do we start and what can we provide. And I think that's one of our goals for this community, or certainly one of my ambitions. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to our panel, and I'm going to turn it back over to Summer. Thank you all.